Monday, April 5th. Walking through the main building, you can see this canopy that runs from the door by the corner cafe to the assisted living dining room. This will let food be transferred while healthcare is using it temporarily. On the south side, many yards of gravel have been distributed, and they are digging trenches to redirect the water flow so we don't have swamps. Workers struggle after a rain or a snow to maneuver on the site. This guy had about 2 feet to walk between the swamp and the boxes. Finally, he set it down and grabbed it with one arm and held the boxes with the other to get by. Last week, SkyTrack stayed busy delivering load after load of yellow mesh fabric. This lets stucco adhere to the white styrofoam. These guys are so fast, I barely caught them covering the white styrofoam with the mesh and the gray stucco. You gotta get up early. Another day, walking up the south side, they had put a pipe from high east on the site running toward door 3. Other workers stayed busy trenching from east to west. I think this was some kind of electrical line because my buddy Dave was working there. Framework has been laid to create a drive-up drop-off place in front of the new assisted living atrium. It will create concrete patio and walkways between the new building and the old building. Let's take a cherry blossom break. This week I got to tour assisted living and a little of healthcare with the AL foreman, Oscar. I will be touring weekly or every other week with the different foremen. Stepping into the lobby, you are greeted by a beautiful reception desk. To the right, the fireplace has been installed, niches for artwork, and they uncovered those great lights. On either side of the door are beautiful light wood benches and screens that you can see out from the inside but cut the sun. This multi-purpose room will be used by healthcare. There'll be a TV where the blue square is, and the furniture is large and comfortable. At the front right corner is a room with a sink and storage for snacks or games or whatever they need to help the residents. Close up, the furniture is lovely. The frames may be metal. I didn't tap on them to be sure. Across from the multi-purpose room is the mail alcove. This is a Mikasa room. The bulkheads have been installed over heating and air conditioning ducts, the walls have been taped and bedded, and a large prefab shower enclosure is waiting to be installed. Not too glamorous yet. I will try to stay in touch regularly with the foreman and find out how they're proceeding so that when I do go into film, there will be actually something new to show you and something to talk about. Near door 8, fences have been erected to make sure no equipment or supplies are parked in the way if a resident needs emergency care. Last week, this fence was erected by door 10. This will take care of the second phase of demolition for healthcare. Make sure no one gets injured by flying debris. On the north side by the casita wall, I looked down to see that footings had been poured and rebar had been installed for the retaining wall. A few days later, from the same vantage point, the wall was probably a third finished. I've got to walk around more often. These guys down below were trying to figure out something and were deeply involved in conversation. A few days later, I didn't catch any workers at the corner by the casita wall, but the progress is continuing. Maybe half finished by now? We played hooky one day and went up to the base of the La Luz Trail. It was 70 degrees out, but there was still snow on the high peaks. With its imposing gray walls, this house almost looked like a fancy prison rather than a private residence. Walking on the north side, I noticed they had taken the fence down by the casita wall. Asphalt will follow. Up high, a sole worker was painting waterproofing in the cutout cubbies for patios. One morning, before I'd even had a cup of tea, I looked out to see the building was no longer gray, but a pale pink. As I used the long zoom on my camera, I could see why it was changing colors so rapidly. Before long, I saw them hoisting bucket after bucket of the heavy, gooey, gritty stucco. Up high on the scaffolding, there are crews working to apply the stucco on all 3 levels. They're going to get done pretty quickly. At the end of that day, you could see the difference between the upper, which had had the stucco applied, and the bottom, which was merely paint. Following morning, they were painting the bump out for the Mikasa dining room, a darker salmon brown color. By afternoon, I heard the telltale scritch and knew they were stuccoing again. And before they went home for the day, the bump out was dark salmon stucco instead of paint. Standing on my balcony, it's beginning to look really nice on this side of the assisted living building. Especially when they take down the majority of the scaffolding. I wonder if they'll put new scaffolding up for the waterproofing or use Skytrack. This sweet baby is Liz Will's great-granddaughter, Mirabelle. How come my pudgy arms don't look that cute? Big yawn, or maybe she's singing. I wonder what song it is. She's quite the fashionista and looks ready to go visit or have fun with her little bitty friends. She doesn't even mind being all bundled up in her car seat, ready to go on a very cold day. Resident Janet Moffat made sure Mirabelle was always warm with this great handmade sweater and cap. I don't know what put this look on her face, but I'm very glad I didn't cause it. She's pretty determined. I think this is the look you get if you come at her with a spoon of peas or something equally noxious. Don't mess with Mirabelle. Near door 3, spring is continuing to show its beauty and color.
Just after we flew last week, when they're spraying the big areas, it goes very fast. Details are slower. You can also see that they're getting ready to pour concrete into the blocks on the retaining wall at the east end. As we come around and look at the east end, we can see not much activity. Like the solarium at assisted living, the end seems to go slowly. Hi, this is Jack Brayer. It's Tuesday, April 6th, 9 a.m., 62 degrees and sunny. Coming around to the south side, we see the frames on the little vents are installed here. Also, there is no plastic on the windows. I don't know why. And the scaffolding is the same. I see no yellow packages of insulation, which we all know is the next step. The roof looks pretty spiffy, except for that open hatch. Again, the water's going to get in. Poor block monster sitting at the end, alone, being forced to be well behaved. Look at those two guys down in the parking lot by the carport. I wonder if they know what they're doing. How many people did you count working on the building? I counted 1. This week we return to Earth, way down to Earth. But first, let's check in on Ginny on Mars. She's free and ready to fly. The prediction now is April 11th. Back on Earth, we have some odds and ends of construction to catch up on. We want to understand the retaining walls. But first, let's talk about the pre-stressed concrete beams used on the roofs of the ground floors.
The position of the cable within the beam has a significant effect on the stress distribution within the beam. You'll notice on my acrylic model that the pre-stressing tendon here is towards the bottom of the beam. And there's a very logical reason for that, but to understand why, we need to look at some stress diagrams to show the variation of stress across the cross-section. Okay, so let's imagine that we've got a beam which is resting on a couple of supports. And we've got some loading sitting on top of the beam. That will induce tension in the bottom of the beam and compression in the top of the beam. So if we were to take a cut through the beam, we would find that we ended up with a stress distribution which looked something like this. We have compressive stresses in the top of the beam and we have tension stresses in the bottom of the beam. Now we don't like these tension stresses, so what we do is to induce some pre-stress into the beam. So if we put the tendon in the middle of the beam, we will induce a uniform compression across the beam. So we can add the pre-stressing force to the force from the load. And if we make the amount of the compression from the pre-stress the same as the amount of tension, we end up with 0 stress there, and we end up with a force at the top here, which is equal to 2 times the compressive stress C. What we want to do is to maximize the amount of tension that we carry. We can choose to put the pre-stressing force at a different location. And so we do it in such a way that it induces 0 stress at the top. And if we put it at the 2/3 of the way down the beam, we find that this stress here is now equal to 2p. So now we can apply the load to the structure, and we find that we can apply twice as much load here as we did before. We end up with a stress distribution which looks like this. So we now have 2c at the top here and 0 at the bottom. This is 2c, this is 2t. The effect is that by choosing to put the pre-stressing cable in the appropriate location, we end up being able to carry twice as much load as we did before. We can see the effect of this on my acrylic model. With the tendon at the bottom position, it's in an ideal position for carrying sagging bending where there's tension induced in the bottom of the beam. And I can put quite a significant load onto this beam before the joints between the segments start to open up. If I turn the beam over, which I can do on my model, but I can't do in the real world, the tendon is now towards the top of the beam. And the effect of this is that it's not good for carrying bending with tension in the bottom. So I need to put very tiny forces onto this beam before the beam the cracks start to open up at the bottom of the beam. And this illustrates the point that engineers need to take account of the loading that they expect to come onto their structure and therefore choose to put the tendon in the appropriate position.
What is the ideal position for the cable in a pre-stressed concrete beam?
If we have a beam which is supported on two supports at the ends with some load applied in the middle of the beam, we find that the beam sags and we get tensile stresses at the bottom and compressive stresses at the top. And we've already seen that under those circumstances, the ideal position for the pre-stressing cable is 2/3 of the way from the top to the bottom of the beam. This is what we call sagging bending for fairly obvious reasons. If, alternatively, we have a beam which is passing over a column and we load it, we say that the beam is in hogging bending because it takes the shape of a hog's back, is where the phrase comes from. Under these circumstances, we find that we get tensile stresses in the top of the beam and compressive stresses in the bottom. In this situation, we would put the cable 1/3 of the way from the top down to the bottom. So you can see that the engineers will choose to put the cables in specific locations depending upon the magnitude and direction of the bending to which the beam is being subjected.
So how are the cables arranged in multi-span beams?
Well, very often we want to make a bridge which is continuous over many different supports. And I've got here a beam which is passing over three supports to give us 2 spans. And if I load this beam up, we find that in the middle of the spans, the beam is in sagging bending. And under those circumstances, we'd want to put the cable towards the bottom of the beam. Over the central support, the beam is in hogging bending. And as we've just seen, to efficiently carry the load in those circumstances, the cable wants to be at the top of the beam. So we would adjust the profile of the beam to follow the shape that we want to get the maximum benefit from the pre-stressing cable. So that means that these sorts of structures are almost invariably made from post-tensioned concrete.
So to summarize, beams are normally partly in compression and partly in tension. Concrete is very weak in tension, so cables are added to pre-compress the concrete so it is never in tension. Our beams were post-tensioned, pre-stressed concrete because they are multi-span beams. So this helps us understand the blue cables in our construction. Next week, we'll apply this knowledge to the retaining walls. Here at Assisted Living, they're starting to insulate the south side. Seems like it'll go quickly. See the yellow packets of more insulation? There's some work being done on the retaining wall. They were tamping down the base layer yesterday, and today it looks like there's some new drainage pipe inside the ditch. There's not much activity on the east end. Notice on the roof that the hatch is closed. Thank goodness for that. The forms are set up for some curbing there by the lobby entrance, but no concrete yet. Now, jumping over to the back side, my wall is still being ignored. They're teasing some stuccoing on the corner there, but nothing yet. On the north side here, the building's starting to look pretty good. Do you think that's going to be the final color? It looks pretty spiffy. Still yellow on the west end here. That's not so spiffy. And here at the very west end, there's lots of activity, starting with that big crane that's lifting a bunch of sheetrock into the top floor. And look at all the guys on the first and second floors putting on the insulation, getting ready to stucco. And lastly, the dozer there trying to fill in the ditch so that they can dig it up again tomorrow. That's enough for this week. Sayonara.